All eyes are on Georgia right now, with the two runoff elections for the Senate set to decide control of that chamber of Congress. If Ossoff and Warnock defeat Perdue and Loeffler, the Senate will be tied, with Vice President Kamala Harris casting the tiebreaker vote, giving the Democratic Party control of both legislative and executive branches of the US government. With little surprise, everyone is impatient, and waiting till January 5th or later to find out the result is difficult. So like always, we turn to political polls to get a sense of where things stand. And if you've been paying any attention to how well polling worked out during the general election, you'll know that there was plenty of room for error, in particular with polls seemingly understating how many votes Republican candidates would get. This video, however, isn't about that polling error, but is rather about a way in which polling results, especially in these upcoming runoff elections, can be very misleading in one particular way. Welcome to Data Demystified. I'm Jeff Gallick, and in this video, I'm going to explain why some leads in polls are a lot more stable than others. If you stick around, I'll help provide you with the intuition you need to dramatically decrease how likely you are to get misled by polls. So let's jump right into it and show you two possible results from two different polls for some fictitious candidates. Critically, just like with the two Georgia runoff elections, we're going to have exactly two candidates. In other elections, you likely have more than just two candidates on a ballot, so things get a bit more complicated there. Anyway, first we have this poll, showing a 6 percentage point lead for candidate A. At second, we have this poll, also showing a 6 percentage point lead for candidate A. Both polls show the exact same lead, and yet the conclusions you should draw from these two polls are very different. Before digging into why, let's get rid of some obvious, but not really relevant in this case, concerns. Yes, polls have error, so those estimates aren't perfect. And yes, there could be some bias in those polls, as we saw in the 2016 and 2020 elections. And yes, there is still time for people to change their mind about who they will vote for before the election unfolds. But all those are true for both sets of polls, so really those aren't going to be problems here at all. The problem is that that first poll isn't reporting one critical piece of information, even though it's there for anyone to see. It's the percentage of those who said they were still undecided. It's easy to figure out since we know that if there are only two candidates and the split was 49 versus 43, then we must have 8% undecided voters. As a quick aside, the reason this is particularly true here and not in other elections is that in other elections, news agencies often don't report the percent voting for third-party candidates, so it's not always clear if the missing percentages are undecided voters or those who are decided but voting third-party. Anyway, our second poll doesn't have that problem since everyone polled indicated a preference for one of the two candidates. Again, in both polls, candidate A has the exact same lead of 6 percentage points, and yet our conclusion about how to interpret those polls is very different. For instance, let's pick an extreme case and say that all of our undecided voters decide to ultimately vote for candidate B. Well, even with that 6 percentage point lead for candidate A, candidate B will ultimately win. Now, I appreciate this is very unlikely. In fact, most polling aggregators and modelers assume that undecideds will split roughly 50-50 between candidates, but that's actually a really big assumption. For example, back in 2016, somewhere around 15% of the electorate had not decided between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump up to 2 weeks before the election, and those undecideds went much more in favor of Trump than Clinton, securing the electoral win for him. So if that split leans one way or another, the overall results of any election might be very different from who happens to be leading in a poll. Consider a closer situation like a 48 versus 50 split or 46 versus 48 split. Both have one candidate up by 2 points, but there are many more undecided voters in that second poll. In the first poll, if every single undecided voter went for the underdog, we'd have a neck-and-neck election. In the second poll, if every single undecided voter went for the underdog, well, the underdog would actually win by 2 points. And yet we rarely hear this narrative when polls are reported on. And if you think those last two examples were just crazy things I came up with for this video, well, they're actually two recent polls. The first was a Survey USA poll from November 30th showing Perdue with 48% and Ossoff with 50%. And the second was an RMG research poll from November 24th showing 46% for Loeffler and 48% for Warnock. Again, in both cases, the leaders were ahead by 2%. But if it were me, I'd feel a lot more comfortable if I was Ossoff, where only 2% of the remaining votes were undecided, than Warnock, where 6% were. The point of all this is that when you see results for polls showing a lead, but not really highlighting the remaining undecided voters, you should very carefully ask yourself if that lead is solid, or if it could be easily undermined if the undecided voters disproportionately go for the underdog. To be clear, I'm not suggesting that all undecided voters vote the same way, or that they always go for the underdog. Rather, I'm suggesting that when you see a lead in a poll, you need to understand the entire context that poll was conducted in. A poll conducted when there are lots of undecided voters tells you a lot less about who's going to win than a poll with few undecided voters. As for Georgia, right now the Democratic candidates are showing a small but consistent lead over the Republicans. But if you're like me, I think a bit of skepticism about the overall accuracy of those polls is totally warranted. Finally, if you like what you saw, I'd really appreciate it if you could hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and click that little bell icon so that you don't miss out on any new content I put out. As always, thanks so much for watching.